Last time we spoke about Hong Xiuquan and how he attempted 4 times to pass the imperial examination, but was met with failure each time. The stress put upon him was too much, causing him to have multiple mental breakdowns and to see visions, leading him to realize he was the brother of Jesus Christ. God and the elder brother Jesus taught Hong Xiuquan how to fight demons and gave him a magical sword to rid the world of them. Hong Xiuquan knew the Manchu were demons, and it was he who would usher in a new heavenly kingdom upon earth. He began to preach to the masses, gathering those he called the God worshippers, and this began to raise concerns with the Qing officials who sought to stamp out what looked like the White Lotus Rebellion 2.0. Now the Qing forces, led by General Xiangrong, were trying to surround the God worshippers to end the menace before it became an even larger problem. This episode is the Taiping Rebellion Part 2, the March to Nanjing. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals is an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have my own 45-minute episode in the Taiping Rebellion, and I'm just releasing a 7-part series on China's warlord era. And I also just wanted to tell those of you here listening to this podcast that a lot of people have come forward asking me to make a Patreon. And to justify doing something like that, I decided I might end up doing some exclusive podcasts there for the various shows that I'm part of. If this is of interest to you and maybe there's a specific subject you want me to cover, which I could in an exclusive episode on said Patreon, well, let me know. Best ways at this point, leave a comment on my personal channel on YouTube or find me at the Kings and Generals Discord. Anyways, back to the show. The Taiping had taken Jintian, but they were being pursued constantly by multiple Qing armies, always seeking to encircle and quell their rebellion. By this point, the Taiping numbered something like 60,000 men, and they sought to seize their first major town, that of Yong'an, present-day Mengshan town. Now, a bit before I get to this, I just want to describe to you a bit about the forces at play. The Taiping, like I said, were around 60,000 strong, and, as you can imagine, were made up of mostly peasantry type. They did not have much in the way of firearms. They were mostly armed with spears ranging from 8 to 18 feet long, some halberds, knives, and swords such as the Liao Yi Dao. There were those with bows and arrows, but archery in this time period was more specialized in northern China, and not so much in southern China. For example, the 8-banner army had Manchu and Mongols who were extremely proficient in archery. But in the south, it was simply not up to par, let's say. There were some firearms consisting of the usual suspects, firelock muskets, and even the hilarious jingals. Women took up fighting in the initial battles, such as Jintian, but there is pretty much no evidence that they took up fighting in battles after 1853. It seems they were fighting most likely out of a necessity in the beginning, but later on were not employed. Although I do know from reading quite a few sources that during certain sieges like that of the siege of Nanjing, they helped dig trenches and did other works, like nursing. Later on, after 1858, there was also an official woman garrison under the Taiping, but it was much more of a ceremonial group and they didn't do actual fighting. Now the Qing military is quite complex at this point. And although I have described it a bit in detail in the past, I would like to refresh your memories because the Qing military will evolve during this conflict, rather dramatically. In the 1850s, the Qing military was roughly 3.4 million men strong, quelling the Taiping Rebellion while simultaneously fighting the Europeans during the Second Opium War. The 8-banner army consisted of Manchus, Mongolians, and Han Chinese, roughly 250,000 men altogether. They were much more of an imperial guard, and they were stationed around Beijing and in northern China. Then we have the Green Standard Army, consisting pretty much exclusively of Han Chinese. They were around 600,000 strong, and they were the real military might of the empire for quite a long time. Their creation was mostly because of a lack of efficiency within the eight-banner army system, and ironically, another type of military force would be created later on in this story because the Green Standard armies became inefficient. There will also be various groups of Europeans involved in this conflict, but that all comes much later on. Now, the last time we spoke, the Taiping were fleeing their stronghold in the Thistle Mountains, and they sought to attack Yong'an. With their large force of 60,000, they took Yong'an easily on September the 24th of 1851. A large reason Yong'an fell so easily was because there was an extreme lack of coordination on the part of the Qing forces. Meanwhile, the Taiping had their five-king system, the north, south, west, east, and flank kings, who were coordinating their military efforts quite well to fend off encirclement efforts by the Qing. It was at Yunnan that Hong Xiuquan enacted a lot of reforms. One of them was to replace the classic lunar calendar with a solar calendar. The lunar calendar was based on the monthly cycles of the moon phases, while the solar calendar dates are based on the position of the sun, i.e. it uses seasons. Hong Xiuquan also began to develop many social reforms that we will talk about much later on. Now, by 1852, the Taiping were gradually driven out of Yong'an by the Qing military who was encircling them, and this led to the Taiping losing 20% of their forces. Now, while this was a terrible loss, do remember, anywhere the Taiping go, they are increasing their number, because they are targeting the countryside, the peasants, all those who are dissatisfied with the Qing Dynasty, which is a large amount of the population. Hong Xiuquan led the god worshippers out of the encirclement at Yong'an, and then he marched into Guangxi province. Now, in the earliest days of the rebellion, while Hong Xiuquan was the leader, it was actually Feng Yunshan, the South King, who was the military mastermind behind them. It was also Feng Yunshan who was the first leader of the god worshippers who called for an open revolt. He was the chief military strategist and administrator amongst them. He was the man who came up with the military configuration, a formidable mind to be sure. On May the 24th, the Taiping marched near Tianjing in Guangxi province, but they had no intention of invading the city. It seems Feng Yunshan made an egregious mistake as his sedan chair was close enough to the city whereupon a Qing gunner, or I guess better said a Qing sharpshooter, fatally wounded him. Hong Xiuquan was outraged. One of his closest comrades was hurt, and he quickly rallied the Taiping forces to surround Tianjing, and within just 2 days they breached its walls and they butchered all of its citizens who did not flee or join the cause. The South King Feng Yunshan became the first high-ranking leader of the Taiping rebels to die when he succumbed to his wounds in June of 1852. Now also in June, the main bulk of the Taiping began to head north in Hunan province, where they captured Jiangsu and began traveling along the Xiang River, planning to attack the hinterlands of Hunan by land and river. The idea behind this was to find multiple paths that were quick, because at the time, multiple Qing armies were trying to encircle them. While they traversed the Xiang River, they came to the Seyi Ford, where they were finally ambushed by a Qing army. The Qing army repelled their northern march, and in the process killed approximately 10,000 Taiping. After this large setback, the Taiping turned their attention to lesser targets. They seized Daozhou, Yongming, Jianghua, Jiahe, Guiyang, and Qianzhou. The Taiping faced another Qing encirclement by the Qing forces led by General Xiangrong in Guangxi, but managed to thwart him and escaped yet again. At this point, the Taiping were operating on a very large scale, threatening Hunan, and it was absolutely terrifying the Qing court, who hastily mobilized a large army to gather in the area of Hengyang and Qianzhou. The Qing sought to block the march of the Taiping in Hunan province altogether. General Xiangrong led 2 Qing forces to make a northern and southern strike upon the Taiping, completely annihilating a Taiping force in the Shunan region. The Taiping leaders were frustrated again and again by encirclement maneuvers by the Qing military. They were unable to break through the Qing blockades. but they began to notice the Qing had distributed the majority of their forces in the Shonan region, leaving the hinterland of Hunan province fairly open. The West King, Xiao Chaogui, detached the bulk of the Taiping forces and bypassed the Qing army holding the city of Quanzhou and made a direct march upon Changsha. When they reached Changsha, Xiao Chaogui ordered a siege of the city. The Taiping began to dig siege tunnels in order to blow up parts of the defensive walls using mines. Meanwhile, the Taiping fanned out, capturing the surrounding area to make sure the city could receive no provisions via land nor river. The former governor of Hunan province, Liu Bingjiang, was about to leave that said post to receive a new appointment in Beijing when the situation erupted. He spoke to the deputy in charge of military affairs, Liu Hojian, who was placed in charge of the city's defenses. At this time, the current governor of Hunan province, Jiang Liangji, had yet to arrive. Thus, Changsha was quite a predicament. There was really no one to command its defenses since it was surrounded. Within the city were 8,000 defenders, while Xiao Chaogui held 3,000 light cavalry and a few thousand other infantry, some of whom were busy garrisoning at Yongxing. When Xiao Chaogui's forces arrived to Changsha on September the 11th, they found a Green Standard Army force and a militia force led by Liu Yang. The Taiping fought them out in the field, exacting 900 Qing casualties, and publicly beheaded the general Fu Chang and the deputy general Yin Pei Li. This led the garrison commander, Zhu Han, to flee and abandon a ton of military equipment. From September the 12th to the 18th, Xiao Chaogui continuously mounted attacks upon the city, while the defenders of the city desperately hurled burning oil, arrows, and rocks at them. Now, Xiao Chaogui only had roughly 4,000 men with him. More were en route, but they were coming in piecemeals. With only 4,000 men, he was unable to mount a powerful enough attack to breach the walls of the city. For example, if he took all of his men to the south of Changsha, the defenders would simply concentrate their 7,000 to the south. If he went north, they would do the same. If he spread out his men, he was in even worse position. It seems in an effort to bolster the morale, Xiao Chaogui decided to personally hoist some Taiping banners while wearing royal robes out on the battlefield. Well, as you would imagine, he was easily spotted by a Qing sharpshooter or someone holding an artillery piece, and he was shot dead. Alongside this, a Qing militia force led by Deng Xiaoliang attacked the Taiping's rear by surprise, and this effectively stopped the siege, forcing the Taiping to withdraw further away from the city walls. Meanwhile, the Qing court was freaking out over reports of Changsha, a significant city that was under siege, and they dispatched a force of up to 50,000 men to concentrate in the area. Upon hearing the news of the incoming Qing forces and the death of the West King, Hong Xiuquan and Yang Xiaoqing led the bulk of the Taiping forces out of Quanzhou overnight, rushing over to Changsha by October the 5th. The very next day, the Taiping made a large offensive out in the field near the tomb of Cai Gong against a Qing force led by Ren Daogui. The Taiping won the battle. They killed General Ren Daogui and wounded his deputy general, Duan. On October the 11th, Hong Xiuquan launched an assault on Changsha, hitting 3 sides of its walls, but the Qing defenders managed to hold on. Then on October the 15th, a Qing army coming from the direction of Quanzhou managed to reinforce Changsha, fighting skirmishes with the Taiping along the way. Despite their numbers, the Taiping were failing to make any progress against the city, and as time went by, more and more of the dispatched Qing forces were arriving to its aid. In order to break up the stalemate, the Taiping leaders decided to cross the Xiang River to open up an attack upon Changsha's western portion. On October the 17th, Xu Dakai, the flank king, led thousands of Taiping to cross the river to attack Zhujiangdu, Nanjing, Hexi, and the line of Monkey Stone, catching the Qing off guard. This infuriated General Xiangrong, who was commanding some of the Qing forces there, and by this point he was kind of something like a rival to the Taiping. I have said his name countless times, and he has been on the march ever since the beginning of this rebellion to try and quell them. Well, he launched an attack against Hexi, but he was ambushed in the process. This led the Qing to send even more forces to take Hexi, but Xu Dakai's men dug in and repelled them. General Xiangrong was humiliated, and this led him on October the 30th to personally lead 3,000 Qing infantry and cavalry to attack the Taiping at Hexi with the intent of cutting them off from the rest of their Taiping army forces. Xiangrong was ambushed yet again, suffered heavy casualties, and forced to flee. While the Battle of Hexi was still raging, the battle to the south of Changsha with the bulk of the Taiping continued. Throughout October and November, large-scale siege assaults were made. The Taiping tried to detonate mines in tunnels to breach the walls, but counter-tunneling by the defenders thwarted their best efforts. At one point, a breach was made in the wall, but the Qing commander, Zhou Zongtang, proclaimed to the defenders of the city that he would pay an enormous sum of money to anyone who helped hurl large stones and rock to close any gaps made by the Taiping, and this proved to be highly effective. The citizens and defenders quickly hurled everything they could at the Taiping, and the gap quickly closed up. Zhou Zongtang won quite a lot of fame for this, and he would become an important player later on. If you did not know, Zhou Zongtang is quite famous for something else in our world, something I am certainly grateful for, as I cook it now and then, General Tso chicken. And as much as I would really love to go into this one, because it is a bizarre and long history, I can't really take too much time. But just to give you the brutal summary, the American Chinese dish was introduced in the 1970s to New York City, and it was inspired by another dish called Peng Chuang Kuei, made by a Taiwanese chef who specialized in Hunanese cuisine. Peng named the dish in honor of Zhou Zongtang. Honestly, people who know more about this history know what I just said is one of many theories as to how the dish came to be. It's quite a rabbit hole, but we are going to carry on. The Taiping's efforts were not working fast enough, and soon the Qing reinforcements were arriving en masse, yet again threatening to encircle them. In view of the deteriorating situation, Hong Xiuquan and Yang Xiuqing both agreed the battle for Changsha was meaningless and that they should just withdraw and take a much more important city. So the Taiping left in the middle of a rainstorm at night after fighting a bitter 3-month campaign over Changsha and its surrounding area. Despite the failure at Changsha, the Taiping were still in a great position, and they were quite confident in their abilities. The Qing had thrown countless armies at them, but they always managed to escape encirclements, and they were able to pick and choose where they fought. The Qing were slow to react, and it was difficult to pinpoint where exactly the Taiping would concentrate their forces next. Hong Xiuquan and Yang Xiuqing chose the formidable city of Wuchang as their next target. The Qing, it seems, did not believe the Taiping would march upon Wuchang, because they had left the path to it quite open. The Taiping took very deceptive maneuvers to try and hide their march on Wuchang. They went along the Xiang River, only to abandon their boats and march overland to another unsuspecting river town, where they stole boats and continued. They would destroy bridges as they moved, and recruit countless boatmen to hinder the Qing riverine units. Countless times they would cross rivers using pontoon bridges, leave them on the other side, and simply find more boats to go downriver. It's sort of like the old ploy of making multiple tracks in the snow when you're invading somebody. The bitter Taiping rival, Xiangrong, was leading many of the Qing forces pursuing the Taiping, and it seems he nor other Qing commanders figured out what was going on, nor where the Taiping ultimately were heading to. After around 600 miles of twists, turns, and tricks, the Taiping army ended up at Wuchang, while Xiangrong was still in Yuzhou chasing a Taiping feint army. The Taiping's last great deception had come at Dongqing Lake in December. The Taiping had captured Yiyang with little resistance, and they seized over 5,000 boats. They took them to the banks of the Yangtze River, where they moved east, downstream. But instead of heading straight at Wuchang, they maneuvered to the north shore and seized the commercial town of Hanyang and Hankou. After capturing these towns, the Taiping constructed 2 enormous floating bridges by linking all the boats together across the Yangtze so they could attack Wuchang on its weaker northern face. The first attack came in the middle of the night when suddenly shouting could be heard, waking the defenders of Wuchang from their sleep. Chang Da-chun, the newly appointed inspector of Shanxi, was in the city at that time taking refuge. The Taiping used cannons to try and breach the wall, but they were unable to breach it, and by dawn, they withdrew. The surprise attack shocked the city, and Chang Da-chun quickly ordered its gates closed. Before doing so, he also sent word to Xiangrong about the plight of Wuchang, hoping he could rally the Qing forces to their aid in time. Meanwhile, the Taiping began tunnel sieging, prompting Ching Dynasty to order countermeasures. Basically, this meant counter-tunneling on the other side of the walls with the intent of caving in the attackers before they could properly detonate mines near the walls. Defenders would create these sunken listening posts to try and pinpoint where exactly the Taiping were digging. Ching Dynasty also ordered the garrison to burn all the homes outside Wuchang's walls to provide clear fields of fire, really pissing off the local citizens. But he foresaw this ordeal, and he promised cash rewards to anyone who captured a Taiping soldier. 20 ounces of silver for any male with long enough hair indicating that they were a veteran, and 10 ounces for shorter-haired men. Xiangrong reached Wuchang and attacked a Taiping force in the eastern suburbs on the 7th of December. But Ching Dynasty failed to get his forces outside the walls to help, apparently because he was too afraid to meet the enemy. Xiangrong's forces were repelled, and the Taiping continued their siege of Wuchang relatively unmolested. By January the 12th, the Taiping tunnelers filled powder kegs full of gunpowder in one tunnel under the Wenqiang Gate and detonated it. Turns out, despite the financial incentives, the citizens of Wuchang were really angry that their homes were burnt down. And basically, they were doing nothing, and some were literally aiding the Taiping siege at this point. The Wenqiang Gate collapsed, and the Taiping swarmed into the capital city, capturing Ching Dynasty asleep. When Ching Dynasty woke up to the reports the city was being captured, he committed suicide. After 20 days of being besieged, Wuchang was in the hands of the Taiping on January the 12th of 1853. At this point, the Taiping had bolstered their ranks to a whopping 500,000 strong. It was after Wuchang where Hong Xiuquan and his fellow Taiping leaders made a serious strategic error. Instead of marching north to hit Beijing, where they probably could have taken it, they decided instead to head down the Yangtze to hit Nanjing. This would have been their greatest chance at toppling the Manchu rule, but apparently the Taiping leaders were given reports that the capital was protected by a very large force, which actually wasn't the case. The Taiping burned their floating bridges behind themselves to delay the Qing forces pursuing them. Parts of the army would march by land, while the majority utilized 20,000 stolen boats to traverse the riverways. While en route to Nanjing, they captured Jiaojiang in western Jiangxi province and Anqing in the capital of Anhui province. They plundered the storehouses and kept marching towards the second largest city in all of China. By this point, the city of Nanjing had swelled to a population of over 750,000, and by the time the Taiping would reach the city, their numbers would be around the same. When the Taiping began to take major cities, the Qing courts panicked, and Emperor Xianfang issued orders for civil officials to start mustering local militia forces to protect their respective jurisdictions. This was very similar to the situation that occurred during the White Lotus Rebellion. These militias were made up of hastily recruited soldiers who usually had very little experience in combat, and weapons were hard to come by. In the beginning, they were worse than ineffective, because their leaders had their own, self-interests at hand. When these militia groups engaged the Taiping, which was rare, they often plundered where they went. In early January of 1853, the Qing statesman and general, Zeng Guofan, was ordered by the emperor to take charge of the haphazard militia units in Hunan province, and to try and use them to take charge of restoring order. Basically, the Green Standard Army and the Eight Banner Army were proving to be completely useless against the Taiping. The Qing were desperate and looking for strong men to pull things together. Zeng Guofan, in a very unprecedented manner, was granted power to take up broad-based military affairs in his region. Emperor Xianfang knew him to be loyal, and Zeng Guofan was an effective military leader. As his teacher described him to the Qing court once, "He is good at recognizing talents, and is capable of synthesizing people's good points. If he is willing to use the wisdom of others as his own, he might make a fine leader." The thing is, Zeng Guofan did not want to be a leader, and he has been called by many the reluctant general. Shepherding of the militia struck him as an impossible task. He even began writing a draft refusing the appointment, which was a huge deal. You didn't just say no to the emperor. But then news came on January the 12th of 1853 that the Taiping had taken Wuchang, the capital of Hubei province, just north of his Hunan. The Taiping now held control of the middle reaches of the Yangtze River. The crisis was becoming larger than anyone had ever thought possible. Zeng Guofan's brothers and father pleaded with him to take up the appointment so he could help save their province from destruction. In the end, he tore up the draft he had written and he accepted the appointment. Now, the Eight Banner Army, made up of mostly Manchu and Mongols, operated mostly in the north. These were the Imperial Guardsmen. They concentrated wherever the emperor was, and mostly around Manchuria. They did garrison a few cities scattered around the empire, but for the most part, the south was protected by the Green Standards. There were roughly 130,000 Eight Bannermen in the region around Beijing. The Green Standard Army stood at around 600,000 in the early 1850s. But those numbers were kind of illusionary. As I had mentioned, corrupt commanders inflated them to pocket money. On top of pocketing money for fake troops, there was also wide-scale embezzlement going on of materials and a huge lack of training. To be brutally honest, most men had not received proper military training since the White Lotus Rebellion, over 50 years prior. To make matters even worse, the Eight Banner Army commanded the lion's share of the Qing military budget, leaving the Green Standards widely underfunded. By tradition, individual soldiers were responsible for purchasing and maintaining their own melee weapons. The state provided firearms, matchlocks mostly, which were useful in China, but extremely outdated compared to that of the West. And you should hear this one. There was actually an edict made in 1816 decreeing that weapons should not be replaced until they had been used for at least 30 to 40 years. It is not a joke to say many of the guns were more than a century-old in use at the time. The Qing military was suffering from a fatal combination of too much peacetime and economic collapse because of the Opium Wars. When the Taiping Rebellion broke out, the Green Standards were functioning more or less as a constabulary or police force, not really a military. They usually kept order, protecting grain shipments and performing mundane tasks like transporting prisoners. Commands were purposely fragmented and distributed among local civil and military officials in jealous competition with another to thwart any potential mutinies against the Qing. This also meant there was a huge absence of any clear chain of command, making it nearly impossible to mobilize against a large enemy like that of the Taiping. Now, Zeng Guofan was well aware of all the problems with the Green Standard Army. As early as 1851, he had advocated for reducing the number of Green Standard troops because they were, as he put it, quite bloated, and they weren't doing anything. A man after my own Ron Swanson libertarian heart. Many men got bored, and they simply took up with bandit groups to make more money. This was also at a time where countless were addicted to opium, and it was literally breaking Chinese society down. As for the effectiveness of the Green Standard troops against the Taiping, Zeng Guofan reported, "As soon as they spy the enemy, they run away, and when the enemy departs, they come back and murder the locals. Then they dress them up as rebels and claim a victory." To a friend, Zeng Guofan wrote this, "Even if Confucius himself came back to life, he could spend 3 years and still not manage to correct their evil ways." After taking the appointment, Zeng Guofan's criticisms of the Green Standard Army increased. He said this, "They just kept chasing the rebels' tail, but they never even attempted attacking head-on. They used cannons and muskets to attack from a distance, but we rarely hear of them fighting in close quarters with small arms." Thus, Zeng Guofan was basically saying the men lacked proper training, courage, and martial skills. From the very beginning, he proposed starting from scratch with a new kind of force. His model was based on the Ming Dynasty, who had formed militias to fight Japanese pirates along the eastern coast. It would be a smaller force, but efficient, carefully trained, and the soldiers had to be courageous. The force began to form in 1853, built upon the Neo-Confucian sense of moral order. The same thing Zeng Guofan learned to discipline himself. Emperor Xianfeng worried he would not be able to do anything in time or have great numbers, but Zeng Guofan replied, "We aim for excellence, not sheer numbers, and we want to be truly effective, not just available quickly." The recruits were to be young men from rural and not urban backgrounds. As Zeng Guofan put it, "Those who want a strong army use soldiers from mountain villages, and they avoid the men of the cities and waterways. Those who live their lives in the mountains and the rural areas are tough, while the ones from the river villages are slippery. The cities are full of lazy and carefree wanderers, while the rural villages have men who are simple and sincere." The recruits were to be selected only by a close cabal of his most trusted friends, family members, and scholars. That process of keeping recruiters a close-knit group would be passed down the ranks, providing a network of close-connected people. Zeng Guofan encouraged loyalty by paying his men very well. A foot soldier under Zeng Guofan could earn over 4 taels of silver per month, triple that of what the Green Standard Army paid. In addition, the men could earn 10 taels more for killing a bandit, 15 taels for capturing one alive, and 20 for a Taiping with long hair. He indoctrinated the men to have a feeling they were serving the country and their emperor. He stressed it was kill or be killed, and he often warned the men, "If you do not hone your skills every morning, then when you encounter the bandits, you will not be able to kill them, and they will kill you." If soldiers ran from battle and they were caught, well, they were beheaded. If any soldiers gave false reports, they would not just lose their heads, they would have placards set alongside them warning others not to do so. The structure of the military was as such. The army of Zeng Guofan was the Ying Battalion, formed of 505 men including officers. Each battalion was made up of 4 shao, regular companies designated as fore, aft, right, and left of 108 men each, plus a personal bodyguard of 72 men for the battalion commander, making up 505 men. Each company was broken into 8 dui squads, 2 jingao squads, 2 matchlock musket squads, 4 sword and spear squads. A normal squad had about 10 soldiers plus a squad officer and a cook. Since jingaos were so unwieldy, those squads received 2 extra men. Then there were the porters, 180 support personnel for each battalion to carry all the supplies. Zeng Guofan also commissioned riverine navies to fight on lakes and riverways, which was novel to most of those in Hunan province. And thus the Xiang army was created, also referred to as the Hunan or Qu army. This type of army was also known as the Yongying, brave battalions, and Zeng Guofan was not alone. In Anhui province there was the Hui army, and another in Sichuan. These militia-type army groups, as you may have guessed, were the building blocks to warlord armies. Now these armies had just begun to form, and some of their units even took part in some of the battles. But it's not until about 1853 where they make a real presence. Yet, we're going to have to leave this for now. We're going to get back to the situation in Nanjing. Upon hearing reports that Taiping were now marching towards Nanjing, the governor of Liangjiang, Lu Jianying, grabbed over 300,000 taels of silver out of the city, and he fled to Nanjing, where he planned to pretend he was mounting defenses there. In truth, the governor was trying to secure his pockets. If he lost Liangjiang, Emperor Xianfeng would most certainly force him to settle up, and he would lose all of his money. Thus, the mess of actually mounting a defense fell onto the governor of Jiangsu, Yang Wending, and General Xiang Zhou of Jiangning. Well, Yang Wending was even more corrupt than Lu Jianying, and it seems because he simply fled to Jianjiang, and he abandoned Lu Jianying and General Xiang Zhou. This sort of also gives you an idea of why the Taiping were largely successful. The Qing were rampant with corruption. Now, Nanjing's regular forces were around 1,200 Green Standard Army units and 4,008 banner, with 15,000 recruited militiamen. When the Battle of Nanjing occurred, it was defended by roughly 20,000 8-bannermen and possibly up to 40,000 Green Standard Army units. The Taiping arrived before Nanjing on March 6 of 1853. The next day, Taiping General Li Kaifeng was leading a vanguard of 1,200 troops where he arrived to Yuhatai, south of Nanjing. The Qing general Cheng Lisan, who had a force of 3,000 soldiers, promptly fled to Nanjing, thus handing over Yuhatai completely intact. Li Kaifeng was unaware of how poorly defended Nanjing was, so he stationed his men at Yuhatai and awaited other Taiping forces to arrive. The next day, Lin Fengxian, leading a division, showed up and both men directed their forces to attack Nanjing together. Li Kaifeng sent 300 soldiers to prod the city, finding none of the Qing defenders were willing to come out and fight in the field. Instead, the Qing fired wildly at the small group, wasting a lot of valuable ammunition. While the Qing regulars dared not to go out into the field and fight, a hastily improvised group of 1,000 porters went out to face the Taiping. The porter group fought bravely and screamed to the city wall defenders to throw them guns and spears to help them win the battle. Liu Jianying, however, thought this might be a ploy, and might I add, he had a good reason to believe so. Many cities that fell to the Taiping were aided heavily by the local populace. Liu Jianying instead ordered artillery to open fire, and while the more battle-hardened Taiping saw the cannons and began to crawl away, the poor ignorant porters were standing tall, still as the artillery smashed them, allegedly killing 500 people. On the 9th, Lin Fengxian held a conference with the other commanders. It was decided Li Kaifeng and Hong Xiuquan would attack Zhu Baomen from Yuhatai, while Lin Fengxian would commence the main siege effort. It was to be the classic cave siege, seen countless times before. Dig a bunch of tunnels and blow up mines to breach the city walls. Alongside the saber work with the tunnels, the Taiping also began a propaganda campaign. Lin Fengxian had his men shoot written letters into the city with bows and arrows, calling on the soldiers and the civilians in Nanjing to rise up against the Qing demons. Lin Fengxian announced to the people they would not disturb them as long as they wrote the words Xiang, King, Heaven, or Lord on the doors of their homes when the Taiping took the city. He vowed the army would not enter their homes and everyone could live. Lin Fengxian also announced the general offensive would begin on the 19th, something the Qing did not seem to believe. Well, on March the 19th, the Taiping brought hundreds of horses carrying effigies of soldiers bearing torches before the west wall of Nanjing. The Qing saw this expecting an attack, and they all rushed to the west wall, but it was far too late when they realized it was all a ruse to draw them closer in as the Taiping exploded mines in all of their tunnels. The explosions within 2 tunnels breached the wall, causing a gap almost 40 meters wide. Unfortunately, the 3rd tunnel explosion went off far too early, killing quite a few Taiping as well. But now the Taiping had access to the city. Upon learning the Taiping were flooding into Nanjing, countless Qing officials fled the city or committed suicide. General Xiangzhou allowed over 4,000 8-bannermen and 4,000 other Manchu to retreat into Nancheng, which was an inner city where Manchu and No Han reside. But he refused Liu Jianying from entering. Liu Jianying, it seems, was abandoned by the Manchu, and as a result was hacked to pieces by the Taiping soldiers who found him. Within Mancheng, General Xiangzhou and Governor Huilangwu chose to continue the resistance, mobilizing women and children, if it is to be believed, to assist in the defense. They fought a bloody battle, and they never surrendered, as was expected of Manchu. Despite the heroic pride of the Manchu being at play, it should not be forgotten, the Taiping literally were telling the entire population of Nanjing they sought to kill all and only the Manchu. During the afternoon of the 19th, Yang Xiuqing personally commanded the front, with Lin Fengxian, Li Kaifeng, Ji Wenyuan, Zhu Siqun, and other Taiping generals to storm Mancheng from the west and the south. It was a fierce fight, with General Xiangzhou directing his men to fire artillery guns and arrows, while the women and children tossed bricks. The Taiping were forced to fight in 6 waves, paying the price of 3,000 men. yet they still could not breach Manchang. To this end, Yang Xiuqing decided to change strategy. He issued an order: those who surrendered would not be killed. Many of the Manchu pleaded with General Xiang Zhou to surrender to save them, but Xiang Zhou was unwilling. Yang Xiuqing was livid, and he had 8,000 pounds of artillery brought up to blow Manchang to pieces. As the walls were battered, the Taiping flooded the inner city and began to hack the Qing defenders to pieces. Upon seeing this, General Xiang Zhou drew his sword and he killed himself. Governor Ho Longwu was shot in battle. As for those who fought, surrendered, or tried to flee, Yang Xiuqing ordered military and civilians alike to be killed, with a reward of 5 taels of silver each. It said 4,000 Taiping received payment. It is estimated 30,000 Manchu family members were butchered upon taking the city. From March the 7th to the 20th, the Taiping carried the siege of Nanjing, where they killed countless high officials and over 4,008 bannermen. The ancient capital of 6 former dynasties, the land of dragons and tigers, was taken in just 14 days, showcasing to the Qing they were on the verge of extinction. I would like to take this time to remind all of you, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have my own 45-minute episode on the Taiping Rebellion, and I have just unveiled a 7-part series on China's warlord era. And as I had mentioned before, I am thinking of creating a Patreon account where I could tackle perhaps subjects I can't tackle on this very podcast. After all, in 19th century China, there is certainly a lot of rebellions that occur. Take the Nian Rebellion, for example. I could very well do that on Patreon if that's something you'd be into. But you gotta let me know, and you can reach me by just laying out some comments on my personal channel on YouTube, or perhaps catching me on the Kings and Generals Discord server. So let me know. Hong Xiuquan and the god worshippers began as just a small rabble of peasants, and they rose to be multiple armies strong, and they seized all the major cities along their march to the secondary capital of China, the Great Walled City of Nanjing. With Nanjing now under their thumb, what would the Taiping do next?